You got a lot of faith. And first of all, I want to raise the same issue that Member Gordon did with respect to the nexus. We have lots and lots of money being taken from manufacturing and electricity producers in an effort to reduce greenhouse gases. The fundamental, I understood an early analysis from LAO that it would take 30 years of operation for the system to actually mitigate its own construction greenhouse gas effects.
If that's a question, I don't agree with that, no. I don't believe that's what they found, or it's certainly not what our numbers show.
Could I ask LAO for a bit of clarification?
I believe that that estimate was made in previous years. I think that we would work with your staff to get you all the data used that was made used to make that estimate, and work with you on getting you that information.
Okay. The other question about so we're going to run an electrified high-speed rail using electricity that's going to produce greenhouse gas emissions. Has that been factored into your conclusions that you can use cap and trade funds?
Sure. Yes, it has, in short. And a few things on that. One, the authority board has set a goal of using 100% renewables for its energy. But that whole calculation of the energy being produced in order to provide the electricity is included in all of the calculations. Those calculations, we're using standard metrics of how to determine those. They've all been reviewed by the ARB as well as others externally to ensure that, again, we're consistent. I would also note that one of the key elements of this is mode shift, getting people out of cars and planes and onto train. And what's been found around the world, and the International Union of Railways has found that high-speed rail in Europe, for instance, produces about 1/9 the level of GHG emissions of airplanes. And so when we look at the dramatic shift that will happen as we build out the system and shift people from planes onto trains, there's a very clear and strong, compelling reduction.
I appreciate that, but given the time to travel on the high-speed rail and given the cost, I am not convinced that high-speed rail competes with point-to-point air travel. And so the whole notion, you're building upon a movement that I think time and price mitigate against. But that's maybe another discussion. Do I understand correctly that it is your intention to power high-speed rail by solar and wind?
No, by renewables. Is the board policy that's been adopted by renewables, which goes beyond solar and wind.
And would include
hydro, I believe, and other emerging. We're working with the Energy Commission
to
determine the sources of that.
Even as large-scale hydro is not considered renewable by the state's own standards. This is the hypocrisy here, folks. Just want to, I need to point it out. I want to, and I'm going to just close because you know where I'm.
And let me just, if I misspoke on that, I apologize. That's not, I was providing an answer off the top of my head. I'm not, so the commitment is to renewables. We've worked with the Energy Commission to ensure that supply will be available.
The hypocrisy I was talking about, and I come from high production of large-scale hydrology on the San Joaquin River and the Kings River, both. And for the state of California to simply outlaw the reach and the use of large hydro renewable electricity is beyond me. It's just, that's the hypocrisy, I think, in all this. But let me just put a little cap on this, and then I'll trade my time back to the chairman. I received the executive summary today of Reason Foundation's analysis, building upon this whole question about the high-speed rail using cap and trade I would suggest, and we'll extend it to the LAO and to members here for informational purposes, this is the general conclusion. High-speed rail would be many times more expensive per ton of GHG emission reductions than all other alternatives, ranging from 75 times to 1,400 times the cost of carbon offsets. High-speed rail not only fails to advance the purposes of AB 32, but it also retards the purposes of state law and policy. How? By inefficiently consuming funding that could be used to obtain far greater GHG emission reductions. Now, granted, Reason Foundation, may be seen as a bit conservative and libertarian. Maybe. I have found that their research is data-based and strongly supported by excellent conclusive information. But be that as it may, pairing what we're seeing from Reason and pairing the LAO's concern, and then finally, members, the I think significant concern of our legislative counsel with respect to the legality of cap-and-trade usage as a mitigation fee really brings into serious questions the viability of what's being suggested here. And I appreciate the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Morales, can I try to seek some clarity from you on the cost side of things? The legislature has appropriated $5.8 billion to date.
That's the combination of federal and state funds, correct? And then for that initial construction.
What is the delta from that point to operation in 2022? How much more total funding?
Assuming the full IOS that's been laid out and the estimated cost of roughly 31, that would leave 23 billion total. We have remaining roughly 4 billion in 1A funds remaining available. Those have to be matched, and so we're looking at a number of different sources to be able to match that funding, and then the cap-and-trade proposal certainly filling a gap in that whole funding package.
So it's 23, and this draws on one of the other points that's made in the staff report. Are we talking about present dollars, or is that future adjusted dollars?
Those are future year of expenditure dollars.
Okay, right, I think that's one of the important things for people to keep in mind. Yep. Is that when we're thinking about the numbers, we typically talk about projects in terms of present dollars, but in this case, a lot of the numbers that we speak about are higher than they actually are if they were to be calculated in present day value.
Absolutely, and I think, Mr. Chairman, I think it speaks to the transparency issues, and part of what you spoke about. What we're laying out is, what will be the ultimate cost of it. But it's like if you buy a house, you say you bought a $300,000 house. You don't say, I bought a $742,000 house because that's what my mortgage payments will be over 30 years. So our year of expenditure dollar is somewhat comparable to that. And what it drives home to, and we've talked about this before, is the importance of getting this program underway and accelerated. Time is the single biggest growth element in cost here. We go from a base year cost of about $54 billion to a year of expenditure figure of almost $68 billion, so roughly $14 billion of cost, which is just time, and over the years of building the system. So whatever we can do to compress that time, the more cost-effective the program is.
Thank you. Let's move on to issue number 6.
One of the important elements of the program, again, as envisioned by the voters and approved by the legislature, is creating, again, the connection, connecting California. One of the important ways of providing the first dedicated passenger link between northern and southern California through the Tehachapis from Bakersfield to Palmdale. That's the next segment as we move south on the iOS to create that connection. The last rail line across the Tehachapis was built in, I believe it was 1874 by the Southern Pacific. This connection will be, again, transformative, and it's the segment we're moving forward to create that north-south connection. Once in Palmdale, it's important to note also that's Palmdale is Los Angeles County. It's served by Metrolink, so we have actually a rail connection at that point into the rest of Southern California as we continue to build out the rest of the high-speed rail system. But we're continuing to move forward on this in terms of the environmental clearances and preliminary design in order to be able to advance this program as the funding becomes available.
Thank you. And of course, the crux of this is making sure that that we understand what the engineering tasks are that lay ahead, and that we're able to address them in an effective manner.
Yes, and we have, the construction we're starting with is. I don't want to offend any engineers by saying it's straightforward, but it's relatively straightforward. It's open land. We're not talking tunnels or anything through the Central Valley section. Obviously, when we get to the Tehachapis, we will be building tunnels and viaducts to get through there. It's a challenge, but it's part of building anything in California, frankly. But also, that's an area where we're really looking to tap into the expertise, not just around this country, but around the world, in building tunnels through mountains and building high-speed rail tunnels through mountains. And we also have in place an extensive risk management process that looks at, and factors in those kind of engineering challenges and identifies those issues early on.
Thank you. Mr. Gordon?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I would note there's a staff recommendation under this issue regarding asking the Legislative Analyst's Office to provide us during the 2015-16 budget process with recommendations on a mechanism to assist the legislature on project oversight to address project risk, and I would move that staff recommendation.
Great. Second. We have a motion and a second on that. Thank you. I think it's a good idea. If there's no discussion, we'll move to a vote on that.
Bloom?
Aye.
Campos? Aye. Gordon?
Aye.
Patterson?
This is the staff recommendation on issue 6 to have the LAO assist in providing a mechanism for project oversight so that the legislature can provide appropriate project oversight.
Yes.
Thank you. Issue 7.
Yes, again, I think the staff's memo does a great job of laying out the ridership projections. I'll just talk about some of the background to the development of this. This is an area, as many of you know, that looking back years was the subject of a lot of scrutiny, a lot of criticism, a lot of skepticism about the viability of the ridership projections. We have spent a tremendous amount of time and effort to really make sure that these projections are, using state-of-the-art processes, are subjected to multiple, first internal and then external reviews, and that we're presenting information that we as an authority and the legislature can act on as we go forward. The general trend over time has been that the overall ridership numbers have come down from what was presented in 2008 and earlier. We're pretty stable from, there's very minor change from the 2012 plan to this one. The changes that are there are reflective of actual data input into the model, data coming out about actual travel patterns within California. What we've seen in the last few years, and this will change again over time, but our model adapts to it, is people are taking more trips overall, but they are of somewhat shorter length. And so we see, as a result of that in our ridership modeling, higher ridership and somewhat lower revenues, because the fares are basically, it's not entirely, but tied to distance. And so that's one adjustment in the modeling. But I just want to, we have a number of processes in place to, again, to advise us and to review and provide independent critique on the modeling process. We have a panel of leading experts from across the country and around the world who work with us on an ongoing basis to review our processes and our inputs into the models and ensure that we're really using state-of-the-art practices. We've had foreign operators look at our projections to test them and validate them. And again, I would note the Government Accountability Office, the federal agency, did an almost year-long review, and their conclusion were that our results were reasonable, which in their terms is about close to a bear hug as you can get. Yeah.
Mr. Patterson.
Questions on rider. Did I understand you to say that over time your ridership estimates have gone down?
Correct. Right.
Does that mean that your ticket prices will have to go up?
No. Ticket prices, we assume fares in the current plan. How those fares ultimately are set will be determined by the operator ultimately, but we assume some average fares in this. And there's a balance between generating revenues and then your operating costs and where that all comes out. So the changes in the ridership still provide a comfortable cushion from our break-even point, which is that point at which our operating costs and the revenues are equal. So, no, we have not had. We've not suggested raising fares and do not include in the model any increased fares.
You still represent that the ticket box and the ridership will cover operations.
Yes.
Okay.
As is the case with every high-speed rail line in the world, including in the Northeast Corridor here in the U.S.
Can I quickly explore capacity, numbers of riders, and time? Will the high-speed rail stop at every station on the route, or will it selectively have express trains that will go direct from, say, LA to San Francisco and bypass Fresno and these other places?
The ultimate operation of the system will be determined by an operator who will be brought on a concession basis to run the system. The expectation is that there would be a variety. There would be some express runs. There would be some that make stops at most stations. There would be some that make limited stops. And you could have express runs from different points as well. So it would be a variety. It's not unlike airlines. You know, you run some, you can fly transcontinental nonstop on some, but most flights are not. But it just depends on the market ultimately.
So generally speaking, the answer to my question was yes, that there's a probability that your operator will choose and select express options and stops along the route. There's a likelihood of that.
That there would be a mix of
yes.
Right, express and stops and different combinations. Correct. Yes.
People who up and down Central California support the high-speed rail because they've got stations in their cities need to know precisely and exactly as soon as possible how often you're going to bypass us. I mean, honestly, this is a part of transparency and getting fact-based decision-making to folks up and down the route. And I appreciate it.
Sure, understood. And I think, again, the key will be those decisions will be market-based. It'll be based on demand, and will be to serve the communities. We can, as we develop that information, we'll be happy to.
Are you suggesting that if the market were to suggest that they only were really interested in riding on high degrees of frequency with full trains from LA to San Francisco, bypassing all of the stops, that we'd be bypassed?
No.
So there's going to have to be some kind of market control, some kind of determination that you're going to stop at the stations. It would be very helpful quickly for us up and down the route to get a good idea of how many times an operator might consider bypassing our stations.
Yeah, and sir, I'd point out, I think people sometimes overlook how much transit ridership there is in the state, even in the Central Valley today. And so, I don't think it's a fair premise to assume that there isn't demand in a Fresno or a Bakersfield or a Tulare Kings. Our total ridership, as we're projecting it, just to put it in some perspective, for the entire system would be less than the ridership on the Fresno Area Express on an annual basis today. So, there is an awful lot of demand out there for mobility, and so I don't want to leave any impression that Fresno or Bakersfield or anyone in the Central Valley will be bypassed.
I appreciate that. I do. Fact of the matter is, oftentimes when I'm riding Amtrak to get here, I have to take a bus from Stockton to Sacramento. The bigger concern I have is that if this system does get built out, and if all the optimism that you give to us in these presentations pans out, I really don't want to see Central California having one train in the morning and one train in the afternoon, and that's it on the choices. We ought to be able to have quick and thorough access to high-speed rail and not be bypassed unnecessarily. I think people in Central California really need some assurance on these.
Sir, I would say, the clear intent of 1A and our job in implementing it is to connect the state, connect all of the population centers. And the Central Valley has been left out before, and so this really is a unique opportunity. The service you're talking about, and I agree, it's frustrating every time I have to do it too, with that bus connection at Stockton. The biggest issue there, and the reason we have to do that, is because we're using, and I'm using we in the general sense here, we're borrowing freight track in order to run, and there are limitations on capacity and what can be done. That's why that bus connection is made, and why there's only one through trip down in each direction, in the morning and evening. Again, the Central Valley is the fastest growing part of the state. Other parts of the state want access to it, and we will provide access both ways.
And I appreciate, I understand, but to me the mix of, there's a large claim that you're going to move an awful lot of people out of airplanes and automobiles, and I am concerned that if pure market forces, and I'm a free marketeer, I'm hoping there is a market for intermediate stops, but with respect to meeting the Prop 1A requirement to get 2 hours and 45 minutes from LA to San Francisco, I don't know how you do it, stopping at every stop along the route. It seems to me that there's going to have to be a significant high mix just to meet the 1A responsibilities with respect to express travel, so that how you get your averages to represent anything close to the 2 hours and a half or whatever so again, I appreciate your optimism.
Sure. Well, I'll say I'm optimistic, but I'm also practical, so I'm not blind to the challenges we have by any means. I would just say, in terms of the market forces, I want to make sure I don't leave the wrong impression. This is still will be a publicly owned system. It will be operated under concession by a private operator. There will be, and we have not yet developed them, but it is something we're working with the peer review group and others to start identifying. There will be some sort of structure around the operations that are ultimately provided, so it's not just an entirely market-based. There are public policy considerations in all of this as well that will be balanced.
Let me follow up on that Prop 1A point that Mr. Patterson makes. My understanding of the provisions of Prop 1A is that there is a metric that requires the train to be able to meet the 2 hours and, I forget what.
40 minutes.
2 hours and 40-minute travel time, but it does not mandate that every train take that time to go from point to point. Is that correct?
That's correct, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an important point, and there was some confusion that arose in a hearing last week about this. The requirement in Proposition 1A is that the system be designed to be capable of traveling nonstop. That's an important distinction as well between Los Angeles and San Francisco and 240, and then other segments have time requirements as well. We are designing the system to meet those requirements, and the peer review group, which is the legislative peer review group, has reviewed all of our work in that area, and the testimony last week was that, in fact, our pure run time, which is that end-to-end nonstop time, right now is slightly under 2 hours and 40 minutes. What got confusing was Mr. Thompson, as chair of the peer review group, then went on to talk about actual operating conditions and used an example of a run with several stops in it that then exceeded that time, was about 3 hours. So there is not a requirement that every train be nonstop. That would be exactly the scenario Mr. Patterson doesn't want to see. But that the design characteristics are tied to that end-to-end run time, and that's what we are meeting.
Thank you. Ms. Campos, did you have questions? Great. All right, then I think we're through with this item. We'll move on to issue 8. This is the greenhouse gas.
Right. Sorry, I'm just looking for a piece of paper here. What is in the budget, in the governor's budget proposal is, well, let me back up first. In SB 1029, there was a requirement by the legislature to produce a report on GHG reductions, which we submitted last July. And that really speaks again to the direct operation of the system, and primarily the GHG reductions that come from direct mode shift. Again, people taking the train rather than driving their cars or taking an airplane. The much bigger reductions, which we have not put out on our own. There are other people who have put those out, but we don't want to put them out until we can feel comfortable that we can back them up fully, are really, again, the bigger picture issue of providing that connectivity between regions, boosting the overall transit system, and providing for more sustainable development consistent with SB 375. A number of things that are happening in the near term in terms of GHG. I mentioned the Caltrain electrification project, which is going forward as part of our program. That is moving forward. That will have an 18,000-ton reduction on GHGs. We are doing a number of things in the Central Valley to improve air quality as we go forward that can also have benefits elsewhere. Urban forestry, for instance. I know something Ms. Campos has been very interested in. We're committed. We'll be planting something on the order of 5,000 trees as part of our program as we go forward. Many of those will be in the Central Valley, but they don't all have to be in the Central Valley, and that can certainly be in other urban areas in the program. We project before 2020. Total reductions of a range of 278,000 to 674,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Again, that's pre-2020, the combination of things. That is not taking into account the transit projects that are moving forward, the connectivity projects that are moving forward based on our program. I do want to touch on, and then ultimately, as we are operating, initial reductions of up to 330,000 metric tons, ultimately leading to almost 2 million tons a year of reduction once the system is up and running. I'd like to speak just quickly to SB 535, and I know something that this committee and others are very concerned about in terms of the investment and the benefits of GHG funds going into disadvantaged communities. There are at least 4 ways that I would note that our program specifically deals with that. One is something we already talked about in terms of the direct investment of jobs. As the system is constructed, we're focusing our employment in disadvantaged areas. If you overlay our system on a map of the disadvantaged areas in the state, there's a strong correlation and a nexus, physical nexus there. Mitigation and air quality improvement is a second area where we would benefit disadvantaged communities. Again, requiring in some of the hardest hit areas in terms of air quality and unemployment, the use of the latest Tier 4 equipment, urban forestry, and a voluntary emissions reduction agreement with the San Joaquin Air District. Third, benefit of tying the economic centers and creating the connectivity between underserved areas whether it's in the Central Valley or elsewhere, to the major economic areas. And then the fourth is investment in local and regional transit in urban and areas, making transit more accessible and practical. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions.